The town was called Mercer Hollow, and it didn't exist anymore by the time I was assigned to it. That's not a figure of speech. The state had decommissioned it in the spring of 1994 after the tailings dam at the old zinc operation gave out and pushed 17 million gallons of acidic slurry through the lower neighborhoods. The water tested unsafe for a generation. The post office was shuttered, the school district absorbed by the county 40 miles east, and the residents were relocated under a federal buyout. The town remained on the maps for a while out of bureaucratic inertia. Then it slid off those two. By the time I drove out there in October of 2008, Mercer Hollow had been a closed file for 14 years. I worked then for a small contractor called Western Records Reclamation. We had an office in a converted dentist suite in Casper, Wyoming, and our job was unglamorous. When a municipality dissolved, or a county consolidated, or a federal program shut down a field office, somebody had to go through the leftover paperwork. We cataloged, we boxed, we shipped what mattered to state archives and pulped what didn't. I had taken the job after my divorce because it required almost no conversation. You drove out, you sorted, you came back. The radio in the truck was the closest thing I had to company. The Mercer Hollow assignment came to me because the man who was supposed to handle it, a contractor named Del Hovey, had walked off the site 6 weeks earlier and quit by phone from a motel in Rawlins. He had not given a reason. The office manager, a woman named Pat who handled all of our scheduling, said only that Del had sounded tired. I asked if that was code for drinking. She said no, it was code for tired. I took the keys and the site map and the access letter from the Department of Environmental Quality, and I drove the 4 hours west through country that got progressively emptier until the road I wanted was a gravel turnoff with a faded sign that said Mercer Hollow 3 with the arrow pointing into a pine break. The town sat in a shallow bowl of land between two ridges, and the first thing you noticed driving in was that it was still mostly intact. The buyout had taken people out, not buildings. The houses on the east side had been demolished because they sat in the contamination zone, and that whole quarter was a flat gray expanse of capped soil with warning signs every 50 feet. But the west side, the older side where the streets curved up against the ridge, was simply abandoned. Roofs sagged, gutters hung loose. A church on the corner of what had been Second, and Hamlin still had its sign out front announcing a potluck for the Sunday after Easter 1994. The records I had come for were stored in the basement of the former town hall, a square brick building with a flagpole and no flag. The DEQ had given me a key and a code for the alarm, though the alarm hadn't worked in years. I let myself in on a Tuesday afternoon, took stock of what Del had left behind, and set up a folding table and a battery lantern in the basement room where the file cabinet stood in 3 long rows. Del had gotten about a third of the way through. His handwriting in the inventory log was square and patient. He had worked through building permits, animal control, and most of public works before he stopped. The last entry was dated September 2nd and read, simply, moved upstairs to finish water department, back tomorrow. He had not gone back. I made a note to start where he had left off, ate a sandwich in my truck, and slept that first night at a motel in the next town over, because the idea of staying in Mercer Hollow itself had not yet occurred to me as something a person would do. The work was slow and dull in the way I liked. I would arrive around 8, brew coffee on a camp stove I kept in the back of the truck, and spend the day pulling folders, transcribing their contents into the inventory and stacking them by disposition. The basement smelled like old paper and the faint mineral tang of a building that had taken on water at some point and dried out wrong. I wore a respirator for the first hour each morning out of habit, and then forgot about it. By the end of the first week I had finished water department and started on what Del's predecessor had labeled, in pencil on the cabinet, town clerk, general correspondence. That was where I found the first one. It was a single sheet of typed paper, dated June 14th, 1994, addressed to the office of the county administrator. It was a status report from the acting town clerk, a woman named Eleanor Briggs, advising the county that the relocation of municipal records was proceeding on schedule, and that she expected the office to be fully closed by the end of the month. There was nothing strange about the letter itself. What was strange was that the evacuation order had taken effect on May 3rd, 1994. Eleanor Briggs, according to the personnel file I had already cataloged, had been relocated to Cheyenne with her husband on May 11th. She had no reason to be writing letters from Mercer Hollow on June 14th. I noted it as an anomaly, the way you do, and kept working. Misstated documents are common. People type the wrong year. People draft a letter in one place and mail it from another. I have seen stranger inconsistencies in tax records than a clerk filing a report from a town she had already left, but 2 days later I found another. This one was a memo from the same Eleanor Briggs, dated August 2nd, 1994, addressed to the Public Works Supervisor, asking him to confirm that the water main on Cedar Street had been properly capped before winter. The Public Works Supervisor had been retired and living in Arizona since April. The memo had been answered. There was a handwritten note clipped to it, in a different hand, that read capped 7/30, valves removed, see attached. There was no attachment. The handwriting did not match anyone in the personnel file I had completed. I sat with those 2 pages on the folding table for a long time. The basement was very quiet. Above me, the building made the sounds buildings make when no one has lived in them, the small adjustments of old wood and settled brick. I told myself there were several reasonable explanations. A skeleton crew might have stayed behind to finalize infrastructure shutdowns. A retiree might have been asked to consult by phone or by mail. Someone with bad handwriting might simply not be in the records I had so far reviewed. I put the pages in a folder I labeled follow-up and went back to work. By the end of the second week, the follow-up folder was 3 inches thick. There were 41 documents in it, spanning from May of 1994 through what I could only describe as the present, though the most recent ones were dated only a few weeks before my arrival. They were all addressed and formatted as official town correspondence. Some were from Eleanor Briggs. Some were from a man who signed himself H. Pell, identified in one letterhead as the Water Department Supervisor, though that position had been vacant since the shutdown. Some were unsigned. They reported on routine municipal matters. A street light on Hamlin Avenue was out and required replacement. The pump at the cemetery well needed servicing. The community center's furnace had been inspected and found to be operating within tolerance. A complaint had been received regarding a dog running loose near the old elementary school, and the matter had been referred to the appropriate authority. There was no appropriate authority. There had been no one in Mercer Hollow to receive a complaint, much less to refer one. The reports were filed in the correct cabinets, in the correct folders, in the correct chronological order. Whoever had been writing them had known the filing system intimately. Whoever had been writing them had been doing it for 14 years. I drove back to Casper that weekend and asked Pat to pull Del Hovey's exit paperwork. She did, reluctantly. Del had not filled out the standard forms. He had simply mailed back his keys with a note that said, "I cannot finish this. Please do not ask me why." Pat had filed the note and said nothing about it, because Del had been her cousin's husband, and her cousin had been worried about him for some time, and the family had decided privately that Del was unwell. I asked her if Del had mentioned the correspondence files. She said he had not. I asked her if the previous contractor, the one before Del, had made any notes I should know about. She looked at me carefully and said that there had been 3 contractors before Del. The first had completed the assessment and left without incident. The second had worked for 2 months and quit. The third was Del. I went home that Saturday and could not sleep. I kept thinking about the handwriting on the memo about the capped water main. It was a careful hand, slightly slanted, with looped lowercase ds. I had seen that hand somewhere before in the files. I drove back out on Sunday afternoon 2 days early, because I wanted to find it. I found it on Monday morning. It was on the back of an envelope in a folder of utility correspondence from 1987. A handwritten note in pencil that read "Call Henry, meter reading 2s." The hand was the same. The looped D, the slight rightward slant. The note was signed with an initial that looked like a P or possibly an H. I pulled the personnel files again. I pulled them all. Mercer Hollow at the time of the evacuation had employed 11 municipal staff members. Of those 11, 10 were accounted for in the relocation records. They had received their final paychecks, signed their separation paperwork, and left forwarding addresses, most of which had been updated at least once over the following decade as people moved on. The 11th was a man named Howard Pell, listed as Water Department Supervisor, hired in 1971, with no separation paperwork on file. His personnel folder ended in April of 1994 with a note that he had requested an extension on his final day to complete the seasonal water testing. The extension had been granted through May 15th. After that, the file simply stopped. There was no record of Howard Pell receiving a buyout. There was no record of him relocating. There was no record of his death, though he would have been 68 years old in 1994 and would be 82 now. There was a photograph clipped to the inside of the folder, a black and white head and shoulders shot taken for an employee identification card sometime in the late 70s. He was a thin man with deep-set eyes and the kind of mouth that does not smile easily for cameras. On the back of the photograph, in his own slightly slanted hand, he had written H. Pell, Water Department. I sat with the folder open on the table for most of an hour. I did not think Howard Pell had been writing letters from a dead town for 14 years. I thought someone else had been, and had been signing his name, and possibly hers, and possibly no one's at all. I thought it was probably a vagrant, or a former resident who had refused the buyout and stayed on illegally, or some local eccentric who came up the gravel road on weekends and played at being a town. There was a rational explanation for everything I had found. I knew that. I held on to it. That afternoon I drove the truck slowly through the western half of the town, the part that still stood. I had not really looked at the houses before. I had been focused on the town hall and the road in. Now I drove past them carefully, watching for any sign of recent occupation. Most of the houses were as you would expect. Broken windows, sprung doors, yards gone to scrub. But on Cedar Street, near the end of the block, I passed a small white house with its windows intact and its front walk swept clean. The grass around it had been cut, not recently, but within the last season. There was a rain barrel under the gutter. There was a pair of work boots on the porch. I did not stop. I drove to the end of the street, turned around in the cul-de-sac, and drove back to the town hall. I locked the basement door behind me when I went back in, which I had not done before. That night I stayed in Mercer Hollow for the first time. I did not plan to. I had meant to drive back to the motel, but it was getting dark and the gravel road was bad in the dark, and I told myself I would sleep in the truck behind the town hall and leave at first light. I parked where I could not be seen from the road. I locked the doors. I lay across the bench seat with a jacket over my legs and listened to the town. It was not silent. A town the size of Mercer Hollow is never fully silent even when it is empty. There were the ordinary noises, wind in the pines on the ridge, a loose piece of metal somewhere knocking against a wall, the small busy sounds of small animals in the grass. But around 11 o'clock I heard something that was not those things. It was the sound of a screen door, somewhere west of me, opening and then closing. It opened slowly, as a person opens a screen door when they do not want it to bang. It closed the same way. A few minutes later I heard footsteps on a wooden porch, unhurried, and then nothing. I did not sleep. I lay in the truck with the keys in the ignition and waited for dawn. Nothing else came. At first light I drove out to the highway and sat in the parking lot of a gas station for 2 hours drinking coffee and trying to decide whether I was going to go back. I went back. I am still trying to understand why. Part of it was the work. The contract was for 90 days, and I had committed to it, and I have always been the kind of person who finishes what he starts, even when finishing is no longer the right choice. Part of it was that I did not believe, in daylight, what I had begun to suspect at night. And part of it, I think, was that I had spent 2 weeks reading the careful, patient correspondence of a person who had been keeping a town alive on paper for 14 years, and I wanted to know who they were. I wanted, in some way I could not have explained then, to meet them. I changed my routine after that. I worked through the morning and broke at noon and spent the afternoons walking the town. I told myself I was assessing the secondary structures for the inventory, which was within the scope of my contract. I walked the main street. I walked the residential blocks. I went past the White House on Cedar Street 4 times over 3 days and never saw anyone. But on the 3rd day, the boots on the porch had been replaced by a different pair, lower and worn at the heels, and the rain barrel had been emptied and turned over to dry. On the 4th day, I knocked. No one answered. The door was locked. I stood on the porch for a long time, and then I walked around the side of the house and looked in through the kitchen window. The kitchen was clean. There was a cup on the counter next to the sink, upside down on a folded dish towel. There was a calendar on the wall. The calendar was open to October 2008, the current month. There were small pencil marks on certain dates, the kind of marks a person makes to track appointments or chores. I could not read them from where I stood. I went back to the town hall. I kept working. The follow-up folder kept growing. I started cross-referencing the reports against each other, looking for internal inconsistencies, and I found instead the opposite. The reports were consistent. They described a town that was being maintained, streetlights replaced, pumps serviced, furnaces inspected, the cemetery mowed twice a year. The community center checked monthly for water damage. They described in the cumulative 14 years of patient, unpaid, unwitnessed work. I found, eventually, the report Del Hovey had been reading when he stopped. It was filed in the September correspondence for 1994, but it had been written, as best I could tell, in late August of 2008, only a few weeks before Del had walked off the job. It was a short report on the condition of the town hall basement. It noted that a contractor was working in the records room. It noted that the contractor had been inventorying the files for several weeks. It noted that the contractor seemed thorough and professional, and that he had been treating the records with appropriate care, and that the writer had no objection to his work continuing. It was signed H. Pell. There was a note clipped to it in the same hand, in pencil, that read, "The new man is reading the older files now. He will find the correspondence soon. Inform me, there is no Eleanor Briggs to inform. Eleanor Briggs has been living in Cheyenne for 14 years. I checked. I called the number listed in her relocation file from a payphone outside the gas station. She answered on the 3rd ring. She was 81 years old, and her voice was thin but clear, and she did not know anyone named Howard Pell, and she had not written a letter on Mercer Hollow letterhead since the spring of 1994, and she asked me, with a kind of careful politeness, why I was calling her about this. I told her I was finalizing the records. She said she hoped I would be careful out there. She said the town had not been a happy place in its last years. She said her husband had refused to drive past the turnoff for the rest of his life, even when it would have shortened their trips. She said goodbye and hung up before I could ask her anything else. I went back to the basement. I read every document in the follow-up folder again, in order, and I understood, slowly, what I was reading. The reports were not addressed to anyone. They were filed, but they were not sent. There were no copies in the outgoing mail logs because there was no outgoing mail. The county had never received any of them. Eleanor Briggs had never written them. Howard Pell, if he was still alive, was the only person who could be writing them, and he was writing them to no one. He was writing them to the files. He was filing them in the cabinets the way a clerk files a record of work performed, and then he was going home, and the next week he was performing more work. and writing more reports, and filing those. He had been keeping the town's records current, not for any reader, for the records themselves, as if the act of being recorded was what made a thing real, and the act of recording was a duty he had accepted and could not put down. I thought about Del Hovey then. I thought about what it would have meant to read this and to understand it, and to keep working. I thought I understood why Del had not given a reason. There was no reason that would not have sounded, when said out loud, like the reason of a man who was unwell. That night I slept in the basement. I had not meant to. I had been reading later and later each evening, and at some point, I put my head down on my arms on the folding table and woke at 3 in the morning with the lantern still burning and a sheet of paper on the table in front of me that I did not remember placing there. It was a single sheet of municipal letterhead. It was typed. It was dated for that day, October 19th, 2008. It read, in its entirety, "The contractor working in the basement has fallen asleep at his station. He appears to be in good health. He has made appropriate progress in the inventory and has handled the older correspondence with discretion. I have left him undisturbed. I will not approach him. He is welcome to continue his work for as long as he requires. HP." I did not move for a long time. The basement was cold. The lantern was steady. There was no sound from the floor above, no sound from outside, nothing at all. I picked up the paper carefully by its edge, and I held it under the lantern, and I read it again, and I understood that I had a choice to make. I could leave. I could put the paper in the follow-up folder and walk out of the basement and get in my truck and drive to Casper and tell Pat I could not finish, and I would not need to give a reason, because Pat would not ask. I could become the fourth man, after Dell, who had walked off the Mercer Hollow contract. I could let the records stay where they were, or I could finish the work. I could complete the inventory. I could box the files for the state archives, and pulp what didn't matter, and clear the basement and lock the door, and turn the keys back in. I could do my job. I could leave the town the way I had been hired to leave it. Closed, finalized, on paper as well as in fact. If I did that, I understood. Then whoever was writing the reports would have nothing left to file. The cabinets would be gone. The basement would be empty. The town would no longer have a record of itself, and the work he had been doing for 14 years would have no place to go. I sat in the basement and thought about what kind of person does work that no one will ever read. I thought about my own evenings in Casper, the apartment I had not really furnished, the meals I ate standing at the counter, the long quiet drives between assignments that I had begun to prefer to anything I might have done with the time instead. I thought about the White House on Cedar Street with the swept walk and the calendar marked in pencil, and I thought about the careful slanted hand of a man who had stayed when everyone else had been told to leave, and who had decided, alone, that the leaving did not apply to him, because someone had to keep the streetlights logged and the pumps serviced and the furnace inspected, and because if he stopped doing those things, then the town would actually be gone, and he was not ready for the town to be gone. I finished the inventory. I want to say that. I finished it because it was my job, and because I had told Pat I would, and because I could not think of a reason to stop that I could explain to anyone, including myself. I worked for another 6 weeks. I boxed the files. I labeled the boxes. I shipped them to the state archives in Cheyenne. I pulped what the contract said to pulp. I cleaned the basement. I locked the door. I drove back to Casper and turned in my keys and submitted my final report, and took 2 weeks of leave I had not asked for. I did not see Howard Pell. I never saw him. I want to be clear about that. I do not know that he exists. I do not know who wrote the reports. I do not know who slept in the White House on Cedar Street, or who emptied the rain barrel, or whose boots changed on the porch between Tuesday and Thursday. I do not know who placed the sheet of letterhead on the table while I slept. I have a description in my head of a thin man with deep-set eyes from a photograph taken in the late 70s, and I have no evidence that the man in that photograph had anything to do with what I found. But I have, in my own apartment in Casper, a single sheet of municipal letterhead that I should not have. I took it. I did not include it in the inventory. I keep it in the drawer of my bedside table because I do not know what else to do with it. I take it out sometimes and read it. It still says what it said in the basement. The contractor working in the basement has fallen asleep at his station. He appears to be in good health. I left the contracting work the following spring. I took an office job with the state. I do not drive out to small towns anymore. I do not handle decommissioned records. I do not, when I can avoid it, stay anywhere alone overnight. I think about Mercer Hollow more than I would like to. I think about the streetlight on Hamlin Avenue, which according to the last report I read, had been replaced in late September of 2008, 2 weeks before my work was finished. I think about who replaced it. I think about whether, with the records gone now and the basement empty, the work has stopped, or whether it is still going on, somewhere in a form I did not see and could not have catalogued. I think mostly about a sentence I have not been able to forget. It was in one of the later reports, filed in the summer of 2003, in an otherwise unremarkable update on the condition of the cemetery fence. It was a note in the margin, in pencil, in that careful slanted hand. It was not addressed to anyone. It said only this: a town is not a place. A town is a record of a place. As long as someone is willing to keep the record, the place is not gone. I finished the inventory. I shipped the boxes. I closed the file. I do not know what I did.